Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. It's my pleasure to have John Haskins on the show. John is a senior fellow for the Public Understanding of Law, Propaganda, and Cultural Revolution at the Inter-American Institute for Philosophy, Government, and Social Thought. He analyzes politics, society, the ongoing decline of the constitutional government, and the root causes of the failures and retreat of conservatism and religion in American society, and just maybe the world in general.
Part 2 of an interview with John Haskins on the Council for National Policy, Conspiracy and the Culture War.
But so this stuff goes back, and in fact, I think I'm one of those people who believes that some of these tendencies arose out of Protestantism. You may like hearing that, and the gentleman you just mentioned that you've interviewed?
E. Michael Jones?
Yeah, and he might like to hear this as well. I think some of these tendencies did come out of, ultimately, out of consequences of the individualism and egalitarianism of Protestantism. I say that as someone with, a 500-year pedigree of Protestantism. But some of the other tendencies, I think, came out of Catholicism. And it kind of became a toxic soup here in certain ways.
Mm-hmm. Well, also remember, this is also added the Catholicism in America, which was Americanism, and the Catholic Church in America was subsumed by Americanism, particularly in the 20th century. So it's one of these things where the idea of the it goes back to the liberalism itself, which, the syllabus of errors written by the Pope in the 1860s, and some of the problems of liberalism itself, the internal contradictions of liberalism. What we're experiencing now, some people say, is the sort of the reductio ad absurdum of liberalism itself. The nonsense where, the gender confusion, these things, the extremist individualist claims which deny basic identity, like sex identity, which ultimately denies you. It destroys the only, the most found basic identity is what sex you are, one or the other. Mm-hmm. And now we're living in an age of so much flux and confusion that's up for debate. But I think, as you point out, this isn't necessarily something. This isn't sort of like a law of entropy. Things fall apart. This stuff is being created. This discord and confusion is being purposely created. Like you say, this meeting in 1969. Well, not as if these people had a pulse on the course of history. They could read history scientifically, like a Marxist could. They claimed to have some sort of scientific read of history. Is obviously they were being supported, connected by important powers. And that same year, in 1969, you had something here, a conference, the Jaffe Memo, that the U.S. government had commissioned with Planned Parenthood to do the very same thing here in the United States. It was to promote feminism, to weaken the family, weaken the role of the father, promote homosexuality in these things. This is why you had all
this came from where? What was the memo?
The Jaffe Memo, 1969. And this was commissioned by the U.S. government. A while back, I interviewed Dr. Nancy Banks, and she wrote a book about, it's a book about a whole lot of things. But AIDS, Africa, and diamonds, about. Well, she in the book, she's very critical and analyzes the AIDS myth, the HIV basis for AIDS, and these things. And she has a very interesting theory, I think convincing. Other people do, like Duisberg and all that, about the myth of HIV. But the social engineering aspect of the AIDS crisis, under the pretext of AIDS education, and saving children's lives because they might get HIV if they engage in unsafe sex. The National Research Council, Rockefeller-funded, working with the Russell Sage Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, put together a sex ed program, I think through the U.S. Public Health Service, that would be instituted through the public schools. This is the 1980s. And to introduce very graphic sex ed programs to students under the pretext of protecting them, from the AIDS epidemic that was supposedly going to break out. And the documents pretty much exposed a plan that it wasn't so much they were about AIDS is that the AIDS hysteria created by the U.S. government was used as a pretext to introduce a sex ed program that was very graphic to middle schoolers and these things that parents would otherwise oppose. But they created the AIDS hysteria, and these things were justified, and it was there not so much to protect the kids' health. It was there, and this is in the documents, as to fundamentally change their mores and attitude towards sex. And
yeah, there's no question. There have been these schemes, conspiracies, whatever you want to call them. They go back quite a ways. I don't know how far back. I mean, I now increasingly believe that the signing of the Declaration of Independence was, if not exactly a Masonic conspiracy, certainly not what we've been told it was. Have you ever interviewed James Perloff?
Yes, I have. We talked about that.
Okay.
Yeah, but the whole the shot heard around the world and all.
Yeah. Now, where did the phrase you use the phrase Americanism? Who's influenced you mainly on that? Is it E. Michael Jones?
E. Michael Jones, and also there is a book written by David Wemhoff that I read, and I interviewed him. John Courtney Murray, Time, Life, and the American Proposition.
Wait, what's David who?
David Wemhoff.
Okay.
And the book is I'm looking at it right now. John Courtney Murray, Time, Life, and the American Proposition: How the CIA's doctrinal warfare program changed the Catholic Church. And what happened was the Church was seen in the post-war era as a potential stumbling block to the Cold War agenda of the CIA. And what happened was they used the threat of communism to more or less get the Catholic Church on their side in the Cold War. And what happened was they developed a plan not so much to oppose the Catholic Church, to weaken the Catholic Church, but to infiltrate it. Because it had offices throughout the world. There's a church in every parish and these things. And so if they infiltrate the Catholic Church and get it on their side, then the church becomes a useful weapon in the Cold War. At the same time, you had the efforts of...
Yeah, but hold on. That's to infiltrate the Catholic Church and with a celibate clergy, where you're presumed to be joining the clergy to the priesthood to do this for the rest of your life. How does the CIA infiltrate an organization like that?
Well, not necessarily the CIA. It's also operating through outfits like B'nai B'rith. It's not just CIA. Again, when we're talking about CIA, we're not talking about CIA proper or Langley.
But no, this is an important point. But the infiltration of the Catholic Church per se.
It was intellectual. It was John Courtney Murray had written a book called The American Proposition. We hold these truths, I think, was the speech he gave. And one thing characters like Claire Booth Luce, who had converted to Catholicism, but she was married to Henry Luce, who was an old Skull and Boneser. Time, Life, and remember, when you
so the infiltration of the Catholic Church was basically at the major Catholic universities.
Yeah, definitely. If you look at what happened at Notre Dame with Hesburgh and the Land O'Lakes Conference, and how that was alienated from the church and they handed over to lay authority, which really was the Rockefellers, and also the Catholic University, where you had the confrontation in 1967 regarding birth control and the reaction to Humanae Vitae. And the whole controversy with what's that professor there? I forget his name. But it was a whole media campaign because this also factors in Vatican II. What happened in Vatican II was the American press, particularly Time, Life, they controlled the interpretation of Vatican II. The myth of liberalization, and some would argue that Vatican II itself was rotten from the get-go. So there's a spirit of Vatican II and there's a letter of Vatican II. People who defend Vatican II say you have to interpret Vatican II in light of tradition. But the problem is the mass media isn't going to do that. They're not going to interpret Vatican II in the light of tradition. They're going to interpret it in a way that's going to subvert Catholic authority. And you have
all right. So here, let me. The couple of questions are raised by this, all this stuff. What would have the CIA? Okay, the CIA is a finite organization, far smaller than the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
You'd have to ask, what kind of resources would it take, even if you go strategically to, Notre Dame and Boston College and Georgetown, and, let's say you pick 10, and I mean, it's how many decades and what kind of resources would it take? So
well, you have to look at it in the context of the times. This is 1945.
Mm-hmm.
America has conquered the world, more or less. They won World War II, defeated fascism. It's holding back the tide of communism, which was a consequence of World War II, and we're not going to get into that. But anyway, what happens, you have to look at the American Catholic Church itself at the time. The bishops, and they saw themselves as Americans first and not Catholics. Okay? So what happened was that the ideology of America, liberalism, took precedent over Catholic doctrine. One thing is this critical idea of the separation of church and state. Okay? Now, America is a proposition nation. America itself doesn't have a religion to bind it. It has many different faiths. I'd argue that the fact that America prior to the second half of the 20th century was very decentralized. And so the fact that it was sort of a polyglot civilization, its decentralization sort of ameliorated that. It became more of a problem when it became centralized after the New Deal. When you can say after the Civil War, really, but after the New Deal, really, concentrated power in Washington, D.C. and these things. And of course, World War II just accelerated that process. Let
me ask you about the bishops seeing themselves as Americans
mm-hmm.
rather than as Catholics or Christians. What could that have been avoided? And if so, what caused it? And I mean, if you have millions of Catholics,
it has something to do with Catholics wanting to be successful Americans,
of course,
wanting to climb the grease pole of America, wiggle up the grease pole of American power, be accepted. Right. Claire Ruth Lewis there's a quote in there. She says that to finally sit at the table, to have a place at the establishment. Well, the problem is, given the true nature of America, the American experiment, and its Freemasonic origins, as you alluded to earlier, maybe there isn't a place for Catholics at the table. Their job is not to be at the table. And in order to be at the table, you have to sell your souls to one degree or another. And that's what many remember. Also, what you also have with Catholics is, particularly with Irish Catholics, is a sort of inferiority complex. You have these lace curtain Catholics who always figure they're not as smart, not as successful as their WASP betters. There's also the Jewish component with Hollywood, which is very important. The Jewish fact here, but I think so. What happened was the American ideology became dominant after World War II. Liberalism itself, and this is very important.
Well, hold on. When you say the American ideology, because when you first use the phrase Americanism, mm-hmm. I'm thinking of the Declaration of Independence, which is probably part of what you're saying, right?
Yeah, it's part of it.
Okay. So then. Okay, by the way, I went back to this. You said something fascinating that I really agree with. At least I would apply it more broadly to anyone who's going to be a genuine Christian. There is not a place at the table in this society. There isn't in
mm-hmm.
modern Germany, in modern Sweden, Britain. There just isn't. And when I look at something like the CNP or the evangelical churches or the pro-life organizations or so-called pro-family organizations, what I see is an ethos manifests in the personalities of the people who I once thought of as American
mm-hmm.
heroes, who are so materialistic, so conformed to a sort of tidier version of the American sleaziness that we're talking about. It's sort of a cleaned up version, just like Mormons present themselves as clean cut, always dressed in a shirt and tie, or whatever. That's what I think evangelicalism has become. And there is this, ultimately the ultimate value, I should say, in American religion today for, I'd say, 98% of the people and clergy is, what's my lifestyle going to be?
Yes.
It's not about Christ. It's not about, and so I think that Christians no longer have a place at the table in this country. We don't have a place at the big corporations, at the big banks, and the courts. We are now experiencing the curses that Moses prophesied upon Israel at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. Because exactly what you described, wanting to climb the greasy pole and selling your soul in the process. Now, was there a way that could not have happened?
Given what America is sort of a Freemasonic Frankenstein monster. It is what it is, right? I think if they maintain their Catholic identity, and a lot of it is it's the what you talking, it's mammon, right? It's the worship of money, and
it's mammon, but it's also social conformity.
Yeah, the Catholic Church prospered materially in America, and the bishops themselves became what they call brick and mortar men. Okay, they wanted to build their schools. You know, they wanted to build their churches and their parishes and these things, and all that's very important. You need an infrastructure. But because of that, they've sort of they kind of lost their pastoral responsibilities, and they sort of this is how it kind of works structured. At least how I read it, and so they kind of passed that on responsibility on to the theologians, who became more liberal. And again, you can't take this out of the context of what was going on at the time. This is the late 1940s.
Are you saying the priests passed on their pastoral duties to the theologians?
Well, the idea of controlling the doctrine, how people were educated.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And you can see that mostly. A great example is what happened at Catholic University when John Cardinal Kroll tried to fire Charles, what's his name, the Curran, and he came out openly opposed to like Humanae Vitae, the Pope Pius the Sixth encyclical on birth control, in 1968. And they fired him. And then this huge protest was mobilized. And, of course, the media, which is obviously opposed to the traditional interpretation by the Catholic Church, would play Charles Curran to be a hero. They could have just, the thing is, they didn't fire him. He didn't have tenure, and his contract expired, so they didn't renew it. And so they just let it lapse. And then the huge protest, and they backed down, and they gave him tenure. And they lost control of Catholic University. They lost control of Notre Dame. That was Hesburgh did that when he handed it over to the lay authority on the Atlantic Lakes Conference. And this is all also in the context of Vatican II and these things. And so what happened was, when I talk about the American ideology, internationally, you had confessional states like Italy and Spain that the American Catholic Church, American bishops, abandoned Franco because Franco was illiberal. He was a dictator. But Spain was a Catholic country. With this church had special privileges, and Spain was Catholic and Catholicism was Spain. It was just all part of the culture. But in the aftermath of the Second World War, this was opposed. This was against the American ideology of separation of church and state. It was considered illiberal. And so, Franco lingered on until 1975, and when he died, they adopted a liberal constitution. And look at Spain now. They have gay rights and these things, and
it's a disaster.
The disaster. The economy isn't even doing well. They said the economy would do better because Franco would, protected the economy from globalism. He had a protectionist economy. But then they opened the economy, and it's worse now than it was under Franco. And now the culture is in utter decline. They're well below replacement level in birth rates, and the country is completely demoralized because it lost its Catholic identity.
Well,
the same thing happened to Italy.
Taking widening the focus or taking a longer historical perspective, I think you'd have to acknowledge that certainly a non-Catholic is going to object. For example, I think some of the perspective I've heard from E. Michael Jones, whom I enjoy listening to, and he's got a lot of great things to say. But when you look at the way confessional states were, Spain, Italy, Ireland, we're talking about Catholic chiefly at the moment, the problems were pretty severe. There was in Ireland massive pedophile issue. I mean, when Catholics see, when I was a kid, a very small kid, my parents were for a while involved in a kind of a fundamentalist group here in Massachusetts, and they were down at having this meeting on the Boston Common, and some priest gave the Irish Catholic police instructions to have my parents and everyone that they were with thrown into jail, which they did. And so, where are these guys thinking that they're Americans before Catholics? I was raised in an environment here in very, very liberal Brookline, Massachusetts, where just noticeably, on average, the Catholic kids were not only rougher, but there were not the moral values that you would associate with a good Catholic. It was just not that the Jewish or the WASP contingents in my school were anything to be very proud of, but people came from the Catholic countries with all kinds of issues to America. So in a way, it's not hard to understand why the English and Scots, and I guess there were some Germans and a few Swedes, but largely Protestants were here, why they would have been appalled at what they were seeing. Now, granted, the people who came, some of them had just suffered a famine from Ireland. They were oppressed by the English. Mm-hmm. But what I'm saying is, when you look at the confessional states, which were Roman Catholic, there were huge problems. The Catholic Church in places like southern Italy seemed to be in bed with the mafia. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not saying this to be, because I don't have a horse in this race. I believe, as I think I said in an email, I believe organized religion in America and in the West is essentially defunct. And that includes my own heritage. I'm glad that there are traditional Catholics rediscovering their faith, and in many cases actually developing more interest in the Bible than Catholics used to, because that wasn't typically associated with lay Catholics. Mm-hmm. I celebrate that. I celebrate most of what E. Michael Jones is saying, but I don't think it's very convincing to be too sentimental about what preceded the mess that we're in.
No, it doesn't say it was a paradise. There weren't problems. But I don't think liberalism is the answer. I think liberalism is oversold because we have a false liberalism here. We have elections that are universally corrupt. If you get into issues like black box voting, computerized voting, voter fraud is always, not even voter fraud, it's actually just election fraud, because it's the people who count the votes that matters. And so even our democracy is a fraud.
I agree with you very much on all that.
We don't have courts that interpret the law based on right. the law. Courts have a cultural and social agenda that's congenial to the oligarchs. I mean, look at some of these decisions are just manifestly absurd, and I'm told I got to respect it because these idiots wear black robes. I can read words. The words have meaning. I know what it means. It's absurd, and so we don't have rule of law in the liberal societies. So again, what we're doing is we're pointing out all the problems of confessional states, ignoring all the horrible problems of liberal states.
Right.
And look, the mafia. I mean, it was the OSS. It was the fascist state of Italy, Mussolini, who suppressed the mafia. Then we liberate Italy, and working with the mafia, right. the Luciano Project, and all that is aggravated because in the post-war era, the OSS and CIA is working with Luciano to bring heroin in from Turkey as a reward for his support during World War II as the Luciano Project. And of course, this continues on in Vietnam, Meyer Lansky, and why they build Las Vegas and these things. So the liberal societies, they'll go in and they'll support organized crime and these things, and then I don't think you can necessarily blame it on Southern Italian culture and these things. The corruption is there, and it probably would be there. But what I'm saying is that I would say, with America is another story. America is a unique situation, and I think Michael Jones would say that there's sort of a modus vivendi existed in the early part of the 20th century, particularly in the North. There's more of an issue in the North, the ethnic issue, is when you have these ethnic enclaves that have their own sort of sovereignty. And and because of this, they had very high birth rates, and they managed to elect a president in 1960 who was Catholic, with the help of voter fraud. But that's an American tradition, isn't it? But let's face it. I mean, both sides cheated. It's a question of which side cheats, and in the end of the game, in the end of the final analysis, it really doesn't matter which party wins anyway, because the oligarchs control both parties. But nevertheless, he sees the sort of way America was situated with these urban neighborhoods, with these strong parishes and these things. This was an acceptable modus vivendi that the elite couldn't stand. A good example of sort of this, I think I mentioned this off call, but we're talking, getting back to the CNP, sort of being controlled opposition, and this was what happened in the second half of the 20th century in America, during the Cold War, when the conservative movement was purged of the old right elements, the anti-imperialist elements, and it was put on board the imperial project, the Truman Project of the Cold War, with CIA operatives like William F. Buckley. And so basically it was housebroken. The conservative movement was civilized. The conservative movement never presented a real threat to the liberal establishment. That was the idea. Well, in the run-up to the Second World War, because the United States it was still regional, and you had regional economic interests. The interest of the Midwest differed from, and they still do, interest of the Midwest different from the interest of Wall Street, the Eastern establishment. Manufacture, agriculture versus finance. And this was illustrated, or at least manifested, in the creation of the America First movement, when the Eastern establishment wanted to get America into yet another war to bail the British out. And this was, the Roosevelt administration working with British, committing treason, breaking the law with British intelligence agents. We always hear a lot of movies made about Nazi fifth columnists, in the run up to the World War II during the Second World War. But what about British fifth columnists? They were inside the White House and inside Rockefeller Center. William Stevenson, the man called Intrepid in these operations, operating in Hollywood. And, they could run circles around the Russians and the Germans in propaganda. But anyway, the Midwest, because it had its regionalism, its regional character with manufacture, you had the America First Committee, which I think represents the last genuine interest group that opposed the American empire, and subsequently was destroyed. And I think I mentioned how it was destroyed was the FBI went in to Henry Reagan's office and stole the mailing list from him. So it was gone. And then, of course, you had the alchemical effect of the Second World War, the sort of this militant collectivism for the war effort, and the psychological warfare that all that entailed, the propaganda. And you have the Cold War, you have Korea, and these things, and that fundamentally changed American society. And not to mention the concentration of power, and the further collectivization of America. Where after the 1950, you couldn't have a genuine opposition to the imperial project.
Do you ever, focus down where I do, where I prefer to mainly? I look at the big picture as you are, but I very much try to get it down like on a dot matrix, zoom in on an old photograph and see what is at the the microscopic level, or what is at the atomic level when the, let's say, Notre Dame went leftist or liberal or kind of pseudo-Catholic and everything else. What's going on at the micro level when you have, at some stage, you have an overwhelming number of faculty, administrators, and students and alumni who are of the old school, for better or worse, okay? And they are gradually being displaced. Why aren't they resisting?
Because it's so gradual, and they're not organized, and they're not even conscious of it. I mean, I'm not. I mean, I'm a product of. I grew up in suburbia, and I wasn't even aware all this was happening until I actually read about it.
Well, but see, I think there's more to it than what you've just said, because they do know there are faculty who know these things are happening.
Oh I see your point.
And they put their heads down, which is what people at CNP did, and people in churches do when kids are getting molested, or when you have a priest who is gay or whatever. People put their heads down and don't want to make trouble.
It's unpleasant.
It's unpleasant, and if you're even if you have tenure at Notre Dame or whatever, what I'm saying is, nature abhors a vacuum, okay? Mm-hmm. And if you have a moral vacuum, yet, let's say a Notre Dame, or pick any institution you want, an entire denomination or a CNP or whatever, you have with all sorts of well-intentioned people, but their intentions are not so, their fealty to the good and to let's say to Christ, to their faith, whatever, is not so intense that they're willing to lose everything for it. Then of what good are they to God or to the institution that's ostensibly that belongs to God? If Christ told us, "I would that you were hot or cold, lukewarm I will vomit out of my mouth," that ought to have strategic value to us as we look at the level of analysis that I'm trying to get to right now. Notre Dame would be a perfect example. It's happened in all kinds of places. How does it function? It happens because people are very, very cowardly and selfish, and that's my general observation about conservatism. There are some, alpha males here and there, and even more offensively, some alpha females. But in general, conservatives just want a paycheck, a big screen TV, a couple of nice SUVs in the driveway. They want their stuff. Yeah. They want their toys. And that's not going to work. It's not going to work. And so, to me, Christ has explained to us, there are so many things like this in the Bible that have profound value to understanding social transformation, cultural degradation, so that there's not even that much of a need for a worldwide, a global conspiracy of extremely powerful bankers and intellectuals or whatever. That will come in and fill the vacuum. But the vacuum is already there. The vacuum is a kind of apostasy in the ultimate sense, which disguises itself as orthodoxy, and therefore becomes, in the biblical scheme, offensive to God, and therefore he pulls out. He says, "You're on your own." You see what I mean?
Yeah,
so much.
I mean, there are. I mean, of course, you have the analogy of the eye of the needle, right?
Yeah.
You have to, the idea, easier for a camel to get through the eye of the needle, the rich man to get into heaven. Of course, the eye of the needle was a gate in going to a city. Your camel had to unburden itself of its goods to get through. Then they put it back on, and so. But there's also you have the story of Jesus Christ when he tells the rich man he must sell all his goods to join him, and that's the only way he can join him is to do this, and he won't do that, right? He can't do that. But then also you have characters like Joseph or Arimathea, who Christ never tells to sell. He was a wealthy man. Christ never tells him to sell his goods because he knows he's a wealthy man who can handle it. So, that it is possible, but there is. It's the.
See, what I'm saying is, what I try to provoke people with is that if you could wipe out all of these conspiracies of the left or of the deep state or the banksters and all these people, if you could wipe them out, wouldn't we still be left with weak men and pushy women? That's really what we'd be left with. And that's not going to work. And part of the reason we're left there is we no longer have taboos that we enforce. I'm sure you'll agree with this.
Yes.
One of the things that made divorce difficult, unfortunately it didn't always make adultery difficult, but it made divorce difficult, is the taboo, the stigma. Now, a woman can go into a family court anywhere in the Western world, and with a snap of a finger she can take the father out of their lives and take the children out of their father's life, as if they belonged to her, but not to him. It's that easy. And nobody will stigmatize that woman. And then those children will suffer what's called parental alienation syndrome. They will be raised to be either to spit upon their father. The quote. Well, anyway.
This creates gender confusion.
It creates that. It creates economic collapse. It creates an amoral generation of people. It creates narcissists.
Latchkey kids.
Yeah, but it creates narcissists. I mean, people who can't even conceive of their own moral responsibilities, because most of that comes from the father. Whatever people want to say about the value of a good mother, there are certain things that are metaphysically masculine in their relation to the other things that your mother can do for you. Mm-hmm. And the absence of the father, I mean, the Old Testament ends with the famous words, I will send my servant Elijah, and he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, or else I will send a curse of total destruction upon the land. Now, what we're seeing is total destruction. Economic, almost everybody in prison or jail didn't have much of a father, if at all. Mm-hmm.
Neither did Bill Clinton.
Right. Well, hopefully he'll end up in jail. So but what I'm saying is that if you could wipe out all these conspiracies, you would still be left with us.
So you don't believe in neutral parenting?
I think that we have fundamentally lost the concept of gender that I don't see a way back, honestly. That may sound very pessimistic. I think there's a ratchet effect in societies. You see it in biblical history. You can see it in the fall of Roman Empire. You can see it throughout history in societies. Yeah. I think there's a ratchet effect. I think there's things that happen you can't
but there are like examples of I would say that there's institutional changes which accelerated this intentionally. One thing is, the conservative governor Ronald Reagan signing California's no-fault divorce law. Right. And right after that, you have all these television shows about divorce. The Odd Couple, right? One day at a time.
Back before you don't even need conspiracies, though, as I'm sure you realize. I'm not. You're obviously very, very well informed and highly intelligent, so I'm not condescending there. But you can go back to the fall of Rome, and even at the time of Christ, and he confronts the woman at the well, and he says, "Woman, where is your husband?" And then he tells her, I think she says, no, he says, "You have had 7 husbands, and the one you're with is not your husband." Well, he's basically saying you're a basket case.
Yeah.
And then you have St. Paul, and I think Peter, telling St. Paul twice says a woman shall not leave her husband while he is alive. And what you find out if you go back and look at the history is that already in the time of Christ and the apostles, marriage was disintegrating because of a form of feminism. Women were getting these legal rights, the empowerment to walk out of a marriage. Eventually, that's one of the things that destroyed the Roman Empire. And it happened, anyway, we can go into ancient history, but I doubt there was any conspiracy there. I think that's, like the second law of thermodynamics. Things wind down, and the nature of fallen man is to satisfy impulses.
That's true, but nevertheless, with the advent, I do think with technology, you can accelerate these things, if not start them. And that's, if you look at the Cultural War, something like pornography is not possible without photography or moving pictures. It's just, you have etchings, it isn't effective. It doesn't have the broad psychological warfare effect. There's a book by Christopher Simpson called The Science of Coercion. And it's pretty much just about how mass communication in the early to mid part of the 20th century was studied by the intelligence agencies in the United States, studied by the intelligence agencies and the War Department for the purposes of mass manipulation. Something like the Princeton Radio Project, the broadcast of Orson Welles' Halloween Eve broadcast of War of the Worlds was a test. It wasn't done accidentally. They wanted to create mass hysteria, and not only did they manipulate people with that broadcast, they also then exaggerated the hysteria created to see what the reaction would be. And the interesting year was 1938, because this was the run-up to the Second World War. And the idea, they were very interested in the use of mass communication. And, of course, the use of cinema and these things, where anywhere from, the Bolsheviks used the cinema. Trotsky did that with his roving trains and films. Propaganda films like Battleship Potemkin and these things. The storming in the Winter Palace, which never occurred, by the way. It's only on film that it occurred. Or in Hollywood itself, it was immediately utilized. And it's sent for propaganda purposes. The creation of the movie star, I believe Edward Bernays came up with that idea. He came up with Enrico Caruso, as a singing icon, the rock star, the idea of the celebrity to change
Bernays
society.
must have been very young at that time.
Yes, he was. He lived to be like 101 or something.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So this is when he's in his 20s, but of course he's the the nephew of Sigmund Freud.
Mm-hmm.
And so the weaponization of the use of psychology, weaponized psychology to manipulate the masses, and mass media, the radio. I mean, look at TV. Wow, that fundamentally changed how people communicate and how they seek out entertainment. It used to be a group event where you go outside and meet with people. Now, the TV restricted it to the family. Now, with the internet, TV's an individual event. Entertainment is with iPods and these things. People are becoming increasingly atomized, and you're creating a bunch of borderline autistic people with some of this technology. Mm-hmm. Of course, this isn't to mention the toxic environment with the chemicals and these things, the gender-bending chemicals that they've, for some reason, put in the very things that contain the food we eat.
Yeah.
Whoops, sorry, another accident, I suppose.
There's no doubt. All of these things are amassed against us. I was going to say back to the, if you don't mind, the theme of Americanism, and what seems to have been, at least to some degree, a Masonic operation behind the signing of the Declaration of Independence. I did. A couple of years ago, because I used to be a strong, like most Americans, very much was indoctrinated to believe in the Declaration of Independence was like third Holy Testament, and I fairly abruptly realized 2 or 3 years ago that one could actually not believe the content of the Bible in Christianity and also believe the Declaration of Independence, and that's a whole other discussion. And I got into a debate by email with various fellows of the institute that I'm affiliated with, and some of them are nationally known law professors who have been, apologists for the Declaration for decades, and another. Do you know the historian Paul Gottfried?
Yes. Okay,
Paul's a fellow of our institute, and he's for decades before I realized it, Paul was aware that the Declaration was toxic. But I think that. When I think of Americanism, and that's why I was asking who's introduced you to that term, I think of it as meaning essentially the doctrines of the Declaration of Independence, even more than, because that would be the propositional, the proposition behind this so-called propositional society, I think, right? Agree?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So,
and that's why John Courtney Murray, who is someone who promoted Americanism, in the late 50s and 60s, and he was promoted by the CIA. And he was a Jesuit priest, and his book, I think, was called "We Hold These Truths," the American Proposition. So he's obviously,
and he basically sold it to Catholics.
Yeah, and there was a debate within the Catholic Church among traditionalist Catholics, and there was it was sort of the Americanists versus the Catholics within the church about this debate. And
was the focus of the debate largely on the Declaration of Independence?
The Declaration of Independence, but the real sticking point was the separation of church and state.
Okay.
Whereas that's not Catholic doctrine. And he tried to make it consistent with Catholic doctrine, which was a violation of various encyclicals, which subsequently, and very problematically for Catholics, popes have embraced the separation of church. Just recently, Pope Francis has said that proposition states aren't valid. I mean, I'm sorry, confessional states aren't valid. They're not.
Oh, Pope Francis said this?
Yeah.
Because I think one of the popes. I want to look into this now because I've been curious about it for a while. But the Catholic Church's reaction to the Declaration of Independence initially was, for a long time, very negative, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think they recognized the Freemasonic influence.
But I mean, in terms of the actual doctrines of the Enlightenment.
Yes, the Enlightenment itself is. Well, I would say the Enlightenment itself, at the final analysis, is Luciferian.
Well, parts of it, parts of it. But I mean, it's difficult when you look at someone like John Locke, or I think Locke was a charlatan and a liar, but he cloaked himself very much in Protestantism.
Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult to know when someone is that clever with their public rhetoric what's really going on. But I think the doctrines of the Declaration are not compatible either with Christianity. In fact, in that email debate that I mentioned, it was pretty much a shutout. I mean, they were the people that, and I say we're talking about some people with national reputations as constitutional scholars and so forth, and we blew them away because when you just start, just put the Declaration of Independence and its propositions up against certain places in the Bible, and it's striking. And so what that means is, and by the way, those who signed it and that advocated, there was a great deal of dissent among the founding fathers about those doctrines. Not all of the signers themselves and others who didn't sign, not all of these people liked it, and some of them just threw up their hands and signed it. Do you know who Barry Shane is, Professor Barry Shane?
No.
At Colgate. You might want to look him up, and he's got some books. He's a historian, has done amazing analysis of the founding era and the fact that the vast majority of the population and many of the founders themselves did not accept the content of the Declaration of Independence. But to me, once it was like opening Pandora's box. Once that became, and I think by around 1800, I think the generation in America after the Revolution that was raised in the aura of the penumbra of the Declaration of Independence, I think could never think the way that their parents or grandparents had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult pill for many patriotic Americans to swallow because, of course, they've been kind of spoon-fed the American, the founding fathers, Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution. This is holy writ to many people, to most people. But like I said, even the Constitution itself is just ignored and cast aside.
I don't know how much you consider this too. There's another aspect of the difference between the separation of church and state versus a confessional state, and that is the displacement of canon law courts. As you know, throughout the history of Christian Europe, at least everywhere that I'm aware of, and I'm not a historian in this area or anything, but the churches had authority over family law, and the state didn't meddle there. You're aware of that, right?
Yeah.
And so once you have so the colonies here generally had, and some of the states, even after the Civil War, still had an official religion, an official Christian denomination. But once you go to, when you get away from that, you don't really have a very good basis for having canon law courts where family matters are decided within the church. See what I mean?
Yeah.
Because the church no longer has any legal standing to do that. And when you do that, you're guaranteeing the destruction of the family. So that, let's say, in Islam, you have, in the Western post-Christian countries, the Muslims are establishing Sharia law courts. Well, more power to them in one sense, because if they don't, they end up where we are, right?
Yeah.
So that's, Sharia law is heavily stigmatized, and there's some things about it, I'm sure. I haven't studied it, but I'm sure there's some disturbing things about it. But in general, that's what canon law based on the Bible would be like. There would be many similarities, but people are ignorant about it because they, it's Sharia law.
Yeah.
But you can't have anything worse than what we have now in the family courts. It couldn't possibly be worse.
No, it's horrible, and you have you have now homosexual couples adopting kids, and these things, and this is being accepted by the institution. By the institutions. I've told this story a couple times, but a young lady was telling me how her kid was in trouble at school, and so she went for a conference, parents-teacher conference. She apparently had called his teacher a fag, and it turns out the teacher is a transvestite. And And she instructed us, so I can't ask him to respect him because I'm Catholic, but I can tell him not to call him names. But my attitude was, among all the adults, all those people in the room, the child had the healthiest reaction to this person. Mm-hmm. Because the entire school system is supporting the transvestite who's in charge of 25, 30 kids, and the school as an institution doesn't recognize a problem with that. That institution is overtly malevolent to the interest of those children, the educational and psychological well-being of those kids. And that's all about, and they're going to promote something like that and wonder why some kids emerge from that class a little confused, and they'll say this is an argument that no one really has any gender because they're confused. Look, well, yeah, you can screw up a kid if you really intended to screw up a kid's identity by subjecting them to crap like that, if you're malevolent enough, right?
Well, especially, I mean, what the children that are going to be, or teens that are going to be most vulnerable are the ones who have a mess at home to deal with. And
which more do because of divorce.
That's right.
And the breakdown of the moral order,
yes.
Which is shown as a lot of that is just things tend to go this way, but they will definitely go that way if it's being promoted by Hollywood, the networks, the foundations, the educational system, the publishing houses like Time Life and these things, which there is ample evidence that these things, remember I say proof, that the types of people who control the entertainment fair, the education, advertising, culture, the culture creators, are malevolent, and that's psychological warfare.
See, you have to find a way to even slow this down. Never mind reverse it. You have to find a way to stigmatize not only the diabolical behavior itself, but the apathy toward it, the indifference toward it, so that it is stigmatized to do nothing. Okay, that is the first stigma, to do nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And because what we're commanded throughout the Bible and by Christ and by the apostles, as well as Moses onward, is have nothing to do with certain kinds of people. And you look at the categories of certain kinds of people, and they're in all of our churches, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that means that lots of people should have been excommunicated. Well, not only in the formal ecclesiastical sense, but from your family home, so that Christmas comes and there's someone not there. Why are they not there? Well, they did something so horrific that we're not going to talk to them until they have repented. Those are the commandments that were given.
Yeah.
So you had a structure for that in the initially in all the churches, and certainly in the liturgical churches like the Catholic churches, where you had canon law, and you had ways of adjudicating it. But when you think of, if you take either the ethnic conception of a church or the parish, geographic conception to an extreme, you lose sight of the fact that actually the church is something invisible. And if someone is excommunicated by God, then to be in conformity with God, you have to have yourself excommunicate them. And that stigmatizing process enables families to stay together. It enables child molesters to be stopped. It enables Marxist priests and theologians to be thrown out of Notre Dame,
mm-hmm.
80 years ago or whenever they first started showing up. So when you're not willing to exercise that, essentially obey the commandments that were given as to how we govern ourselves and how we watch over each other, if you're no longer willing to do that, you're going to be absolutely wide open to anybody who wants to come in and subvert you.
Yeah. In the name of inclusion, diversity, tolerance,
right.
Your community is destroyed. And if you're going to have a community, you have to have, at some level, the right to exclude, to maintain standards.
Well, you have a duty. You have a duty.
Yeah.
It's an existential decision. If you don't exclude, if you have, let's see, I think years ago there was something called the Conservative Club at Harvard. Okay, now some liberal wanted to join. I think it was a Marxist or whatever. So they said, well, we can't get funding unless we allow them. We won't get university funding, whatever. This could have probably happened in many campuses. It probably did. In fact, I think I've heard of it happening at pro-life groups on campus.
Yeah.
And then, then somebody else joins and they call their friends, and pretty soon the board or the executive board of this club is now all composed of people who have the views contrary to the purpose of the club, right? So it's not just a right to excommunicate or exclude; it's a duty, because if you don't do it, then you have nothing left, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the churches are the first line of defense for that. The churches the churches did capitulate in letting civil government create family courts. Where St. Paul says, how can you go to court against your brother? In other words, and he says, can't even the least of you in the church resolve these? In other words, don't you have any resources among you so that you don't have to go out to pagans?
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's where, in the West, you have this principle, you have the church and the state being separate. And both the church checks the state. It's it's a separate power. And of course, in the East, you have this, I think it's Sinfonia, where the church is part of the state. It defines the state. The weakness with the West is the church, in the interest of the church being separate from the state, has been increasingly marginalized. It has no power whatsoever. And it's just another group, right? Particularly in the United States, where you can be a Catholic, you can have your church, you can have your buildings and all that. You can go to church an hour a week, and you can worship whatever the hell you want, whatever, as long as you don't make too much trouble, right? And that's the deal. And so it's a trap, because you be comfortable and just don't make trouble. And that's what's happened in the United States. The church can't be militant because it has no real power, and that's why it's in the state it is now in the 21st century. Again, it's an illiberal position to take, but that's American liberalism, Americanism. It's these presuppositions that we're given. But I would argue that even the promise of freedom that liberalism supposedly offers is a false promise. We don't have that freedom.
Of course,
We have consumerism,
right,
which creates the illusion of freedom, I guess you could say, for many people.
Yeah, it's a slavery. It's a form of slavery.
It's a form of slavery, and I could argue is that those who say that, regimes like Franco, there were dictatorships, and how can you have a state church? That's unfair, and these things. Well, America, by its own standards, fails. By its own proclaimed standards, because we don't have fair elections. It's corrupt to the core. I don't have any control, or I have no idea what's going on inside the Federal Reserve Board meetings. And these things decide the fate of the economy, and who gets rich and who doesn't. I have no control over what's going on in the CIA or NSA. There's so much is. How many documents the government classifies every year? Millions of documents. That's nothing to do with national security. It's there to cover up incompetence and corruption, or just to cover up accountability. Mm-hmm. These things. It's ridiculous. It's not. We're not. Our liberal society does not give us freedom. Doesn't give us oversight. Doesn't give us understanding of the workings of government. And we have to grope around in the dark and try to get some sort of inference from the evidence that we happen to see or touch, but we don't know what's really going on. All I know is that what's going on is corrupt, because that's what happens when you don't have sunlight. Corruption festers, and that's what we have. So my point is, even the claims of liberalism, they don't even provide what they say they provide. So their criticism of illiberal societies is I don't think it holds any water, at least not in my book.
Oh, I agree. No, I agree with you. In fact, I now I no longer believe. Well, this is in keeping with something taken for granted by the founding fathers, with all their flaws. Some of them were certainly Masons, although it's impossible, maybe at least very difficult to know in most cases how serious they were as Masons with their social members. But at least they did have a profound understanding that this experiment in self-government was completely dependent on the moral fabric of the people.
Yeah.
And that you couldn't expect people to govern themselves who were not moral.